Kicked out at 17, an orphan inherits a dusty old fire station. What he found inside would change everything. If you've ever felt lost, or like the world had forgotten you, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. It's for all of us who have had to find our own way home. The bus wheezed to a stop, its brakes sighing like a tired old man. For 2 hours, I had watched the manicured lawns of the city suburbs bleed into ragged farmland, then into the dense, anonymous green of the forests that choked the highway. Now, there was just this, a single peeling sign that read, "Welcome to Northwood, population 847. The driver grunted, a sound that meant this was my stop. I grabbed my single duffel bag, the sum total of my 17 years on this planet, and stepped out into the cold. The doors hissed shut behind me, and the bus pulled away, leaving me in a cloud of diesel fumes and a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against my ears. This was it, the start of my new life, or more accurately, the start of whatever came after the life that had been chosen for me. My name is Leo, and until 8 o'clock this morning, I was a resident of the St. Jude's Center for Boys, a ward of the state, a rounding error in a bureaucratic ledger. But a week ago, on my 17th birthday, a woman in a stiff blazer named Mrs. Gable had called me into her office. She didn't wish me a happy birthday. She slid a thick manila envelope across her desk. "There's been a development in your case, Leo," she'd said, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "It seems your maternal grandfather, a Mr. Alistair Finch, passed away some time ago. He named you in his will. You've inherited a property." I just stared at her. My mother's father. I'd been told he died before I was born, that my mom was all alone. Another lie in a long list of them. "The state's guardianship is hereby terminated," she continued, as if reading a grocery list. "You're emancipated, effective immediately. There's a bus ticket in that envelope and a key. The address is on the deed." I was too stunned to speak. Kicked out, a year early. They'd found a loophole, a way to wash their hands of me, and they took it without a second thought. That was the system, efficient, cold, and final. I was no longer their problem. So here I was, standing on the cracked pavement of a town I'd never heard of, clutching a key that felt impossibly heavy in my palm. The air was different here. It smelled of wet pine and wood smoke, a clean, sharp scent that was nothing like the city's perpetual exhaust fume haze. I looked at the address scrawled on the yellowing deed, 14 Cedar Street. I didn't have a phone with a map, so I just started walking, following the logic of the street numbers. The town was small, a collection of tired-looking storefronts huddled together on a single main street. A hardware store with a faded sign, a diner with buzzing neon lights that flickered even in the daylight, a post office. A few people glanced at me, their faces curious but guarded, the way people in small towns look at strangers. I kept my head down, the collar of my thin jacket pulled up against a wind that had a real bite to it. Cedar Street was just off the main road, and there it was, number 14. It wasn't a house. It was a 2-story brick building, old and proud, with 2 massive wooden doors, arched at the top, where fire engines would have once roared out. Above the doors, faded white letters spelled out, "Northwood VFD Station, number 1. My inheritance. A derelict fire station. A joke. It had to be a joke. The bricks were dark with age and grime, and ivy snaked its way up one side, its tendrils creeping into the cracks in the mortar. The windows on the second floor were dark and blank, like vacant eyes. A thick layer of dust and grime coated every surface. It looked less like a building and more like a tombstone. For a moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk, the weight of the duffel bag pulling on my shoulder, and I felt a despair so heavy it was hard to breathe. They hadn't just kicked me out. They'd sent me to a graveyard. I almost turned around. I could take the next bus to anywhere, try to disappear. But where would I go? I had $43 in my pocket and a profound lack of anywhere else in the world to be. This was it. This was all I had. Taking a deep breath that tasted of dust and decay, I walked up the 3 concrete steps to the smaller side door. The key was old, made of heavy, tarnished brass. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. I slid it into the lock. It resisted, grating with rust and disuse. I had to jiggle it, putting my shoulder into the door, until finally, with a loud, protesting clunk, the lock turned. The door swung inward on creaking hinges, opening into a vast, cavernous darkness. The air that rolled out was thick and stale, the smell of time itself, of settled dust, decaying paper, and cold, still air. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me, plunging me into near total blackness. I was home. A sliver of gray light from a grimy window high up on the wall was just enough to show me the outlines of the space. It was huge. The entire ground floor was one massive garage, the concrete floor stained with oil and time. In the center of the room, draped in a massive, ghostly white canvas sheet, was the hulking shape of an old fire truck. It sat there like a sleeping iron giant. To the side, old lockers stood in a silent row, their doors hanging ajar. Faded yellow hoses were coiled on racks against the wall, their nozzles tarnished. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform blanket of dust that softened every edge and muffled every sound. My footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space. It was colder in here than it was outside. I dropped my bag on the floor. The sound was swallowed by the silence. For years, I'd lived in a world of noise, the constant shouting and clatter of the group home, the drone of the city. This silence was a living thing. It felt like it was watching me. I fumbled along the wall until my fingers found a light switch. I flicked it up. Nothing. Down. Nothing. Of course, the power was off. My heart sank a little further. I spent the next hour just walking the perimeter of the ground floor, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. I found a narrow, steep staircase in the back corner and made my way up. The second floor was laid out like a small apartment. There was a cramped living area with a threadbare sofa and a single armchair, both draped in sheets, just like the truck downstairs. A small galley kitchen was coated in a film of greasy dust, and a tiny bathroom held a clawfoot tub stained with rust. There was one bedroom. Inside was a simple iron frame bed, a nightstand, and a wooden wardrobe. This must have been where he lived, my grandfather, the man who was a ghost to me. I ran my hand over the dusty surface of the nightstand. There was nothing personal here. No photos, no letters, no clutter. Just a stark, empty space. It felt like he had just vanished. As dusk began to settle outside, turning the gray light inside to a deep, inky black, a new kind of cold began to set in. A deep, bone-chilling loneliness. I was 17 years old, completely alone, in a dead man's empty fire station in the middle of nowhere. I sat on the edge of the dusty bed, and for the first time since leaving St. Jude's, I let the tears come. I cried for the life I never had, for the mother I barely remembered, for the grandfather I'd never known. I cried because I was scared, and because for the first time in my life, there was no one to tell me what to do next. The silence of the old building just absorbed it all. After a while, I had nothing left. I was just empty. I curled up on the mattress, not even bothering to take off the dusty sheet, and pulled my jacket tighter around me. Sleep was a long time coming. The next morning, I was woken by a sharp, insistent knocking on the side door. It echoed through the building, loud and jarring. For a second, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. Then the cold and the dust reminded me. I stumbled down the stairs, my muscles stiff and sore. I opened the door a crack and squinted into the bright morning light. A woman stood on the steps. She was probably in her late 50s, with sharp features and gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a dark, practical pantsuit and held a leather briefcase. "Leo Miller?" she asked. Her voice was crisp, all business. I nodded, not trusting my own voice yet. "I'm Sarah Albright," she said. "I was your grandfather's attorney. I handle his estate. May I come in?" I opened the door wider, and she stepped inside, her sensible heels clicking on the concrete floor. She took in the cavernous, dusty space with a single, sweeping glance, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem impressed or surprised. "I was notified of your emancipation," she said, getting straight to the point. "Frankly, I'm surprised St. Jude's moved so quickly, but that's the state for you. I trust you have the deed." I nodded again, pulling the folded document from my jacket pocket. She took it, scanned it with an expert eye, and handed it back. "Right. Let's not mince words, Leo. You're in a difficult position." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "Alistair left you this property. It's all he had. Unfortunately, he also left you a significant amount of debt. 5 years of unpaid property taxes, to be precise. The town has a lien on the building. You owe them just over $32,000. I felt the blood drain from my face. $32,000. I had 43. I can't pay that," I stammered. "I know," she said, her tone softening just a fraction. "Which brings me to this." She pulled out a second, slimmer folder. "This is an offer from a development group, Sterling Properties. They've been trying to acquire this land for years. They want to tear this place down and build luxury condos." She slid a single piece of paper towards me. "They're offering $50,000, as is." $50,000. It felt like a fictional number, an impossible sum of money. Enough to go anywhere, to start over for real. "If you accept," Ms. Albright continued, her voice level, "my firm will handle the transaction. We'll pay the back taxes from the sale price, take our fee, and the remainder, probably around $15,000, will be yours. Free and clear. It's a clean break. A chance for a fresh start." I looked around the dusty, silent fire station. It was a ruin, a burden. What did I care about some old building I'd never seen before, left to me by a man I'd never met? A man who, for all I knew, hadn't cared enough to even see me once in my entire life. This wasn't a home. It was a liability. Taking the money seemed like the only logical choice, the only sane choice. "It's a good offer, Leo," she said, seeing the calculation in my eyes. "It's probably the best you're going to get. Sterling knows about the tax lien. They're bottom feeders. But in this case, They might be your only way out. I told her I needed to think about it. She nodded, seemingly expecting this. "You have 72 hours before the offer expires," she said, snapping her briefcase shut. "They like to apply pressure. My card is on the table. Call me when you've made a decision." And with that, she was gone, leaving me alone again in the echoing silence. But now the silence was different. It was filled with numbers. 50,000, 32,000, 15,000. A clean break, a fresh start. It was everything I thought I wanted. For the rest of the day, I wandered through the building in a daze, the developer's offer turning over and over in my mind. $15,000 was a lifeline. It was a bus ticket to a city with jobs, a security deposit on an apartment, a chance to be a normal person. All I had to do was sign a piece of paper and walk away from this cold, forgotten place. But something kept nagging at me, a small, persistent question. Why? Why would my grandfather leave me a building he had to know I couldn't afford? Why saddle me with a debt that would force me to sell? It felt like a cruel prank. Or maybe he just didn't care. Maybe he'd signed a will years ago and forgotten all about it, forgotten all about me. The thought left a bitter taste in my mouth. That night, I decided to start cleaning. I couldn't stand the dust anymore, the feeling of being in a place that hadn't been touched or cared for in years. If I was going to sell it, the least I could do was leave it a little better than I found it. I started upstairs, in the small apartment. I found a bucket and some old rags in a closet, and, using water from the toilet tank, I began to wipe down the surfaces. It was slow, methodical work. Wiping away the grime felt like wiping away the neglect, the sadness that clung to the air. As I cleaned the small office area, just a desk and a chair in a corner of the living room, my rag caught on something on the floor. It was a loose floorboard right under the desk. My heart gave a little thump. I'd read enough books to know what a loose floorboard could mean. I pried at it with my fingers, and then with the blade of a rusty screwdriver I found in a kitchen drawer. The board came up with a groan of old wood, and there, nestled in the dark, spider-webbed space between the joists, was a metal footlocker. It was an old army green box, about the size of a shoebox, secured with a heavy-duty padlock. It was heavy. I lifted it out and set it on the desk, my hands trembling slightly. What was inside? Money? Old documents? I shook it, but nothing rattled. For hours I worked on the lock, hitting it with the screwdriver, trying to pry it open. It wouldn't budge. It was built to last. Frustration began to set in. This box felt important. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. It felt like the answer to the question that had been haunting me. Why? I finally gave up on the lock and went downstairs to the main garage. I remembered seeing a workbench in the back corner. Maybe there was a tool, something stronger. Under another dusty tarp, I found it. The workbench was covered in old tools, all neatly arranged. There were wrenches, hammers, saws, and a heavy-duty crowbar. I carried it upstairs. It felt like a key of a different sort. I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the footlocker's lid, right next to the lock. I put all my weight on it. The metal groaned. I pushed harder, my muscles straining. With a sudden, violent screech of tearing metal, the lock's hasp ripped free from the lid. The box was open. I lifted the lid, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I just stared. The box was filled with money, stacks of it, $100 bills bundled together with rubber bands. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than I had ever seen in my life. I counted one stack, $5,000. There were 7 bundles, $35,000. Just enough. More than enough to pay the taxes. My mind was reeling. Why would he hide cash in the floor when he owed so much in taxes? It made no sense. Then I saw it. Underneath the bundles of cash was a thick stack of envelopes, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. They were addressed to me. To Leo. My hands shook as I untied the ribbon and picked up the top letter. The handwriting was strong and clear, the ink slightly faded. I opened it and began to read. "My dearest Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, then it means I am gone. And it means the state has finally sent you here. I am sorry. I am so sorry for all of it." My eyes filled with tears, blurring the words. I wiped them away and kept reading. The letter, and the dozen that followed, told a story that unraveled my entire life. My grandfather, Alistair, hadn't abandoned me. He had been trying to protect me. My father, a man I'd never known, wasn't just some guy who left my mom. He was involved with dangerous people, a local crime outfit that had its hands in everything in this region, including, I would learn, Sterling Properties. When my mother died, my father tried to use me as leverage against my grandfather, to get him to sign over the fire station and the land it was on. Alistair refused. There was a fight. My father disappeared, and Alistair, fearing for my safety, made the hardest decision of his life. He put me into the state system, deliberately cutting ties, making it look like he wanted nothing to do with me. He knew they would watch him, but they wouldn't bother with a forgotten kid in a group home 100 miles away. He made himself a ghost to keep me safe. He wrote me a letter every single week for 17 years, letters he could never send, pouring out his heart, telling me about his life, about my mother, about the fire station that had been his father's before him. He told me he loved me, over and over again. The back taxes were part of the plan. He deliberately let the debt accumulate to devalue the property, to make it look like a worthless liability on the town's books. It was a shield. He knew Sterling Properties, the public face of the same criminals my father was involved with, would eventually come sniffing around. His plan was for me to arrive, find the money, pay the taxes, and secure the deed before they even knew what was happening. It was a desperate, long-shot gamble, built on nothing but faith that I would be smart enough and stubborn enough to figure it out. He hadn't left me a burden. He'd left me a test, a choice, and a weapon. I sat there on the dusty floor, the letters spread around me, the cash sitting in a neat pile, and I cried again. But these weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of grief for the man I never got to know, and of a fierce, burning anger at the people who had stolen him from me. And for the first time, looking around the dusty old fire station, I didn't see a ruin. I saw a fortress. I saw a legacy. I saw my home. And you know, sometimes life puts a choice in front of you that feels impossible. It feels like you're trapped between a rock and a hard place, with no good options. Have you ever been there? Faced with a decision where the easy way out feels wrong, and the right way feels terrifying? If this is hitting you right now, if you've ever had to make that kind of choice, I want you to know you're not alone. This community we're building here, it's for people who understand that. People who know that the hardest paths often lead to the best places. Take a second to hit that like button if you believe in fighting for what's right, even when it's hard. And stick with me, because what I did next wasn't just about a building. It was about reclaiming a life that had been stolen from me. The next morning, I found a payphone outside the diner on Main Street. My hand was steady as I dropped the coins in and dialed the number on Sarah Albright's card. She answered on the second ring. Albright. Her voice was as crisp as ever. "It's Leo Miller," I said. My own voice sounded different to my ears, deeper, more solid. "I've made a decision." There was a pause on the other end. "And?" "Tell Sterling Properties their offer is rejected," I said. "I'm not selling." There was another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear her calculating, reassessing me. "Leo," she said slowly, her tone cautious, "I advise you to reconsider. This is a significant risk. You have no income, no resources. How do you intend to handle the tax lien?" "I have the resources," I said, thinking of the cash in the footlocker. "My grandfather provided them. I'm paying the taxes in full, today." For the first time, I heard a crack in her professional armor, a flicker of something that sounded like surprise, maybe even respect. "I see," she said. "Alistair was a complicated man, full of surprises, even now." She paused. "All right, Leo. If this is your decision, I will abide by it. But you need to understand what you're doing. Sterling won't just walk away." "They played dirty." "I'm not afraid of them," I said, and the words felt true. I'd spent my whole life being afraid of being forgotten, of being worthless, of being alone. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had a history. I had a purpose. "Very well," she said. "Bring the funds to my office. It's on the second floor above the hardware store. We'll go to the town hall together. And Leo, be careful." I hung up the phone. The fight was on. I walked into Sarah Albright's office an hour later with $32,000 in my duffel bag. The office was small and cluttered with books, but it was neat. She looked up from her desk as I came in, her eyes going straight to the bag. She didn't say a word, just nodded towards a chair. I sat down and put the bag on my lap. "Show me," she said. I unzipped the bag and showed her the bundles of cash. She examined one, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at me. "He always told me he had a contingency plan," she said, almost to herself. "I thought he was just being a stubborn old fool." She leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "He would be proud of you." That was it. That one sentence. It was all I needed. It felt like a benediction. We walked to the town hall, a small brick building next to the post office. The woman at the clerk's office looked stunned when Ms. Albright explained we were there to pay the full delinquent tax bill on the old fire station. In cash. She had to call her supervisor. There was a lot of paperwork, a lot of counting, a lot of suspicious looks in my direction. But at the end of it all, I walked out with a receipt stamped "Paid in Full" and a deed to the property that was clean and clear. It was mine. Really and truly mine. As we stood on the steps of the town hall, Ms. Albright turned to me. "This is where the real work begins," she said. "Sterling will come at you another way now. They'll try to get the property condemned, or they'll use zoning laws against you. They will not give up." "Then I won't either," I said. She gave me a rare, thin smile. "Alistair said you had his blood in you. He said you were a fighter. I'm beginning to believe him." That afternoon, a sleek black car with tinted windows pulled up in front of the fire station. A man in an expensive suit got out. He looked completely out of place in our dusty little town. He walked right up to me where I was sweeping the steps. "Leo Miller?" he asked. His smile was slick and predatory. "I'm from Sterling Properties. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We heard you rejected our very generous offer." "There's no misunderstanding," I said, leaning on my broom. "I'm not interested." His smile tightened. "Look, kid, that building is a wreck. It's a public hazard. We're doing this town a favor. We can make this easy for you, or we can make it very, very hard. The choice is yours." It was a threat wrapped in a business proposal, the kind of thing my grandfather had written about in his letters. I looked him straight in the eye. "This is my home," I said. "You and your company are not welcome here. I think you should leave." For a second, he looked like he was going to say something else, something uglier. But then he just shook his head, a look of pitying disgust on his face. "You're making a big mistake, kid," he said, before getting back in his car and speeding off. I knew he was wrong. For the first time in my life, I knew I was doing exactly the right thing. The days that followed were a blur of work. With the $3,000 I had left, I got the power and water turned back on. The building groaned to life. Lights flickered on, water gurgled through the old pipes. It felt like I was waking it from a long sleep. I spent every waking hour cleaning, scrubbing away years of grime and neglect. I pulled the giant canvas sheet off the old fire truck. It was a beautiful machine, a 1950s American La France. Its red paint faded, but its chrome still gleaming under the dust. It was a relic from another time, a symbol of everything this place used to be. A place that helped people, a place that stood for something. As I worked, people started to notice. An old man named George, who ran the hardware store, stopped by one afternoon. "You're Alistair's grandson, aren't you?" he asked, his eyes kind. I nodded. "Saw you turn down the Sterling Vultures," he said with a grin. "Good for you. Your granddad was a good man. Stubborn as a mule, but a good man. If you need anything, any tools or supplies, you come see me. We'll work something out." He was the first. A few days later, Maria, the owner of the diner, brought me a hot meal. "You can't work on an empty stomach," she said, handing me a container of stew that was the best thing I'd ever tasted. She told me stories about my grandfather, how he'd come into the diner every morning for coffee, how he was always fixing things for people around town. Slowly, piece by piece, a picture of Alistair Finch began to form in my mind. Not from his letters, but from the memories of the people whose lives he'd touched. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a part of this town, and I was starting to realize that I was too. The fire station wasn't just a building. It was the heart of a community that had been dormant, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. My biggest ally, besides Ms. Albright, turned out to be George from the hardware store. He was a retired mechanic and knew the old fire truck inside and out. He started coming by in the evenings, and together we began to work on the engine. It was a greasy, frustrating, wonderful process. He taught me how to clean a carburetor, how to check the spark plugs, how to read the soul of an old machine. "Your granddad kept this thing in good shape," he'd say, wiping grease from his hands. "He always said you had to be ready, just in case." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I didn't ask. I was just grateful for the company, for the easy way he shared his knowledge, never making me feel stupid for the things I didn't know. And I didn't know a lot, but I was learning. One rainy Tuesday, Ms. Albright called. "They've filed a complaint with the town council," she said, her voice tight. "They're claiming the building is structurally unsound and a public nuisance. They're petitioning for an emergency demolition order." My stomach turned to ice. "Can they do that?" "They can try," she said. "There's a town meeting Thursday night. You need to be there. And you need to be ready to convince the council that this building is worth saving." The dread was back, cold and familiar. I was just a kid. How could I stand up in front of a town council and convince them of anything? I was good at being invisible, at staying quiet. I wasn't a public speaker. I wasn't a fighter, not like that. I told George about it that evening, my voice heavy with defeat. He just nodded, tightening a bolt on the engine. "Let him try," he said calmly. "This town might look sleepy, kid, but we don't like being pushed around by city slickers in fancy suits. You just show up. We'll be there." Thursday night, I walked into the town hall. It was packed. I'd expected a handful of people, but it felt like half the town was there. George was in the front row, and he gave me a solid nod. Maria from the diner was there, with a group of her regulars. I saw faces I recognized from the street, people who had started to give me small smiles and waves as I worked on the station. The man from Sterling Properties was there, of course, with a sharp-looking lawyer of his own. They presented their case first, showing glossy photos of the fire station at its worst, talking about property values and safety hazards and progress. Their words were smooth and convincing. When they were done, it was my turn. I walked to the podium, my hands shaking, my throat dry. I had a speech written out on a piece of paper, but looking out at the faces in the crowd, I couldn't read it. So I just spoke. I told them about my grandfather. I told them about his letters, about his plan to protect me and the building. I told them what the fire station meant to him and what it was starting to mean to me. I didn't talk about property values. I talked about legacy. I talked about home. "This building isn't a nuisance," I said, my voice getting stronger as I spoke. "It's a landmark. It's a part of this town's history, and it's my home. Sterling Properties doesn't want to build condos. They want to erase a piece of your history because it's standing in the way of their profit. Don't let them do it." When I finished, the room was silent for a beat, and then George stood up and started to clap. Slowly, one by one, others joined him. The room filled with applause. The man from Sterling looked furious. The town council voted. The petition for demolition was denied. Unanimously. I had won. We had won. That night felt like a turning point. The fight wasn't over, but the dynamic had shifted. I wasn't just some orphan kid squatting in an old building anymore. I was part of Northwood. The community that had started to form around me now solidified. People started showing up to help. A retired carpenter offered to help me fix the big wooden doors. A plumber fixed the leaky pipes in the kitchen. The local gardening club came and planted flowers in the dirt patches out front. The fire station was slowly, beautifully coming back to life, not just through my efforts, but through the efforts of the whole town. It became a project, our project. We held a bake sale to raise money for new windows. We had a town barbecue in the engine bay. The cavernous space that had once felt so empty and lonely was now filled with laughter and light and the smell of sawdust and coffee. One afternoon, a few months after the town meeting, George and I were putting the final touches on the fire truck's engine. "All right, kid," he said, stepping back. "Give her a try." I climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was cracked but soft. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then, with a deep, rumbling roar, it came to life. The sound was incredible. It vibrated through the whole building, a powerful, living heartbeat. George had a grin on his face a mile wide. "She's still got it," he yelled over the noise. I looked at the beautiful, restored machine, a symbol of so much work and hope, and I felt a sense of accomplishment so pure and deep it almost hurt. We had done it. We had brought it back. Life settled into a new rhythm. I was working part-time at George's hardware store to earn some money, and every other moment was spent on the fire station. Ms. Albright was handling the legal skirmishes with Sterling. They were still trying, but their attacks were becoming more desperate, less effective. They had lost the support of the town, and they knew it. The fire station was becoming something more than just my home. People started talking about turning the front part of the engine bay into a small-town museum, a place to store the history that Sterling had tried to tear down. I loved the idea. The building didn't just belong to me, it belonged to all of us. I wasn't just protecting my inheritance, I was protecting ours. One evening, I was up in my grandfather's, my apartment, reading his letters again. I had read them all dozens of times, but I always found something new. This time, I was reading his last one. "Leo," he wrote, "I don't know if this plan will work. I don't know if you'll even get these letters. All I have is hope. Hope that you have your mother's strength and my stubbornness. This building isn't about money. It was never about money. It's about having a place to stand, a place to fight from, a place to call your own. Don't let them take that from you. Whatever you do, make it your own. Build something good there. That's all I've ever wanted for you." I folded the letter and looked out the window. The lights were on in the diner across the street. George was closing up the hardware store. A couple walked by, holding hands. I wasn't in a graveyard anymore. I was in the heart of a living, breathing town, a town that had taken me in. I had a place to stand, and I was building something good. It's funny how life works. The thing you think is a curse, the thing that feels like the end of the world, can sometimes be the beginning of everything. That fire station looked like an abandonment. It looked like a burden, but it was a gift. It was a map left for me by a man I never knew. A map that led me not to a treasure, but to a home. It taught me that inheritance isn't about what you're given, it's about what you choose to build with it. It's about fighting for the things that matter, even when you're scared. It's about realizing that home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's the people who stand with you inside them. And what my grandfather truly left me wasn't a dusty old building. It was a second chance. It was the chance to have a family, not one I was born into, but one I had found, one I had helped to build. So I want to ask you something. What in your life looked like a curse, but turned out to be a blessing? What inheritance, not of money but of strength or love or even a difficult truth, has shaped who you are? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one because your stories matter. They are part of this larger story we are all living. This channel is a place for people who have been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. If that's you, if you believe in second chances and the power of finding home in the most unexpected places, then I hope you'll subscribe and become a part of this community. We're all just trying to find our place to stand, and sometimes we have to build it ourselves.